So welcome everyone to the last seminar for the spring 2024 semester. And here today we have Peter Muller with the Pew Charitable Trust talking about building disaster resilient state budgets. Peter is a senior officer with Pew's Managing Fiscal Risks project, and he conducts research and engages policymakers on topics such as natural disaster budgeting, other new and emerging risks, and state management of federal funds. I hope you all enjoy the seminar, and we will have the questions and answer session at the end of the presentation. Peter, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen for some slides here. If you can let me know if they are showing up.
Looks good.
Awesome. Yes, well, so like you said, I'm Peter Muller with the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I'm going to give an overview of our research and policy work focusing on disaster budgeting and spending today. Before I get into it, for those of you who don't know about Pew, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and public policy organization. One of our key focus areas is state fiscal policy. And so the work I'm going to talk about is kind of all fitting into our broader focus within that work, thinking about long-term budget stability. So we have a few kind of key research questions that have driven that work in the area of disaster budgeting. And we take kind of an unusual lens, maybe, in that we look at disaster budgeting all in terms of how is it a risk to that long-term state fiscal stability. So let's see. This is in some of these questions may seem a little simple. We kind of gear our work towards framing and laying out this information for a policymaker audience most of the time. Some of these questions have answers or at least partial answers, while others we kind of use as a springboard for future research and opportunities to engage with policymakers to kind of fill out evidence gaps, improve the way that states budget and spend on disasters in a way that's more in line with principles of resilience, risk reduction, and equitable outcomes. So I'm going to start off really broad, kind of why are we tackling this topic in the first place? Should be pretty straightforward for this audience, I assume, but disasters are getting more frequent and severe. A number of ways to quantify it, but I'll just throw out a couple. Flooding is almost a daily event over the last few decades, with floods happening in 8 out of every 10 days. If we look at wildfires in particular, the average acreage burned in the average of just the last 5 years leading up to 2021, it was 68% higher than over the previous 30 years before that. And as you can imagine, the costs associated with the events are also rising. So many of you may be familiar with the concept of the billion-dollar disasters tracked by NOAA. The frequency of those billion-dollar events has doubled compared to 20 years ago. And so as those costs for those kind of billion-dollar things spread across lots of sectors, lots of actors, individual households, national governments, global industries, our research, we've really narrowed in on just one piece of that puzzle, which is interest in just the fiscal policy issues. And so that's just what the government spending is related to natural disasters. Although all of the whole big picture, obviously, is extremely important. From the data that we have, which is limited, and I'll talk about it a little bit, public spending on disasters, along with the frequency, is on the rise. So to give just one example, in the wildfire space, combined spending from DOI and Forest Service, it doubled on wildfire suppression, doubled between 2011 and 2020. To put a little visual to those numbers, this chart shows Forest Service, Interior, and FEMA spending on wildfires over that decade. And you can see the upward trajectory. Overall, we can say that this kind of rising spending, which is taking place across different types of disasters, is really putting pressure on budgets at all levels of government, as policymakers really try to figure out how to find the resources to meet this growing need while also still trying to maintain all of their other policy priorities that they try to address in their budget going forward. So how have we addressed these questions? I've kind of broken it down into some like 3 levels of questions that we've researched. The first order of questions are kind of just establishing that baseline. What are governments paying for when it comes to disaster assistance? Who is doing that? Who is paying? Who's responsible for paying for what? And how much are they spending? Just sort of the baseline, like which these things are deceptively hard to answer for how simple those questions are. Then we looked at the sort of a second order on top of that. How are governments structuring their budgets to ensure that the funding they need for the things they are paying for is available? And how are those current budgeting and spending practices holding up as disasters are becoming more frequent, more severe, and therefore more expensive? The structures of how governments are putting money away for these incidents doesn't need to change in that front, which leads naturally to the third set of questions about recommendations for what kind of new steps, what kind of changes need to happen in terms of how budgets are structured to meet this growing need. So I'll start with just the what we're talking about when we're talking about disaster spending. We generally kind of break it out into four categories for the emergency, for disaster management: the after the fact type of spending on response and recovery. That's the types of things, the immediate, the activities intended to limit loss of life and injury and property damage for response and kind of the immediate aftermath. And then the recovery activities designed to restore communities to normal or better conditions in the short and long term. The degree to which, spending on recovery happens is coming from private insurance versus government. It varies depending on all sorts of things, but that is where a lot of the spending takes place. Then you have the things that happen before disaster strikes, spending on preparedness, the planning, the training, pinpointing the resources that will be needed in the event of disaster. And finally, mitigation, all the steps that can actually reduce or eliminate the harmful consequences of disasters. And this ends up being a big focus of where we think a lot more effort needs to go as we keep moving forward. So our most recent research on this has focused kind of more specifically on wildfires. And the kind of categories of spending are pretty similar in wildfires. So I just threw this up to show the difference, that it aligns as well. Suppression can be treated as response. You do get to kind of stop the wildfires as they're happening in a way that doesn't necessarily happen with other disasters, but it all aligns pretty well. I will be going back and forth with giving some wildfire specific examples as I am talking through this, because that is where we have looked the most closely most recently. So that's what we pay for, very broadly, high level speaking. But what about who pays for it? So all three levels of government, federal, state, and local, have some role in paying for this diverse set of activities. This graphic up here is a very oversimplified version, but the version of that is when a disaster hits, local governments are kind of the front line, first responders. As a disaster gets too large for a local government's resources, states can step in to provide additional resources and support. And then as it gets even greater, the federal government can step in when there is a gubernatorial request for a presidential declaration. This next one here is kind of, again, looking at a wildfire specific version of that, where you still have grants going from federal to state to local as fires get larger and larger. But there is also an added element of reimbursement for services that takes place in both directions among all three levels of government, that's related to all the different fire agencies responding to any given event, and then figuring out who was responsible for paying for what after the fact and reimbursing. On this flow chart, you can also see there are a number of different agencies listed as examples at each level of government, which kind of brings us to another part of the who pays question. It's not just which level of government is paying for each element, but there's an extra layer of complexity in terms of as this spending is spread across different agencies and departments, that makes it even harder to get a handle on how much is actually being spent, who's spending for what. At the federal government, at least 17 major departments and agencies are involved in paying for disasters in some way. At the work we've done at the state level shows similar levels of complexity for that as well. So those first two questions of kind of what do we pay for and who pays for it, when it comes to disaster assistance, they have complex answers, but knowable answers. There's lots of activities being funded across the disaster life cycle, and they're being paid to some extent at all three levels of government. And they're being executed by numerous agencies and entities. The next question, though, about how much governments are actually spending, and that's where it gets a lot trickier, in large part because of that complexity. There is really no comprehensive central tracking or reporting of that spending that we can find. Start at the federal level. Certain agencies and oversight bodies do have some information on some parts of federal disaster spending, though it's not comprehensive. So you can get publicly available data on, say, from FEMA about trends in their public assistance programs, which is great. But if you want to do cross-agency, some sort of cross-agency spending, it becomes a lot more challenging. The most comprehensive effort we have seen is a report from 2016 by the Government Accountability Office that was then updated in 2019, and it estimated about $460 billion of disaster in spending on just disaster assistance between 2005 and 2019. But that effort was based on a very labor-intensive report that went to every agency, that went out to lots of federal agencies, worked with each of them to try to tally up everything they could find that was related to disaster assistance. Data was collected in 2016, and when they wanted to update it for 2019, they just included additional funding that had been included in supplemental appropriations bills for disasters, and did their best guess that it was 460 billion, which makes it very likely an undercount. What about states and localities? That's where we really get into some unknowns on top of that. On top of all the complications for the federal government of the money being kind of fractured across different agencies, there's this added challenge of disentangling federal support that comes from the support that comes directly from state or local government's own tax sources, their own kind of general fund contributions. That makes it really difficult to disentangle that, both because it gets mixed together, but also federal reimbursements can span numbers of years in terms of how long it takes to get reimbursed. So you don't have an answer until many years after the disaster has occurred. And if nobody is going back and tallying it up, then you never really hear the complete impact on the state or local budget of any particular disaster. Most states, as a result, most states do not comprehensively track this disaster spending information. There's some individual examples we found that are a little bit illustrative. State of Washington, they did go back and look at some of their wildfire suppression costs and looked at just from state dollars that their suppression spending tripled when you look at the first half of the 2010s to the second half of that decade. And so when we do get that kind of data, it's really useful and important and can help inform policymakers about how much this growing disaster frequency is starting to impact their budgets. But those kind of detailed levels of data are few and far between. That lack of comprehensive spending data, it also affects our ability to kind of assess how much money is going towards pre-disaster investments for mitigation activities versus the after-the-fact spending on response and recovery. Given all of the holes in the data on the spending, it's pretty difficult to calculate. There is one study from Brookings that estimated at the federal level, just looking at the federal level, a 7-to-1 ratio of recovery versus mitigation spending. Continuing to build out the data on this to better understand the breakdown could really help inform policymakers when they make decisions on how much resources they're putting towards that response and recovery, the kind of stuff they're forced to do, versus how much they're investing in the more proactive measures. So long story short, how much does government spend? We don't know. We need more data to answer the question. But where data does exist, we know it's rising, and we know that it disproportionately happens in a reactive way, as opposed to the preemptive investments like mitigation that can reduce the overall exposure to risk. So up to this point, I've been talking kind of generally about all three levels of government. The bulk of Pew's research on this topic, we have turned with a particular focus towards states. You can't look at states in a vacuum on this. The whole disaster assistance system in this country is very intertwined, but there are some reasons that we are particularly focused at the state level. One is, unlike the federal government, states have to balance their budget. So to the extent there is a new or growing cost driver at the state level, It's really important to understand that, see how it can be better managed so that it doesn't disrupt all the other services states are looking to provide in a unnecessary way. Second, the state role in disaster assistance is sometimes overlooked, and even when there is federal support, states play a role in supporting local governments and individuals in smaller disasters that aren't large enough to receive federal assistance. They contribute cost shares and matches for many federal grant programs. And then finally, the federal government does continue to play a very big role in all elements of disaster assistance. There is a steady stream of proposed policy changes that have come over the years, calls for reform that could, if they were to be implemented, make states take on a bigger chunk of the responsibility in paying for these. And so understanding what states are paying now, how the current system impacts them is really important for kind of evaluating these policy proposals as they roll through that would try to shift more of that burden toward the states. So with all of that, I'll get back to these overarching questions here. Having done the lay of the land stuff, the next question is sort of how do governments ensure that funding is available? How do they budget for these incidents? And again, we have some answers here. In 2020, we did a 50-state study trying to understand how each state, what processes each state has available to them to fund their portion of disaster costs as disaster strikes. And we generally grouped them into two big buckets, sort of the preemptive mechanisms and the more responsive kind of after the fact approaches. The preemptive, you have statewide disaster accounts that are accounts specifically intended for dealing with disaster spending, and then rainy day funds where it is still money put in preemptively, but maybe primarily intended for economic downturns. But some states are allowed, depending on the states, there are rules that allow them to use that for disasters versus in a handful of states they're not allowed to use the rainy day fund for that purpose without some sort of change in law. On the other side, on the reactive side, pretty much every state allows or uses supplemental appropriations in some circumstances that it's going back to the legislature, asking for more money after a disaster happens to deal with the needs. And then most states have some version of executive transfer authority, where there is money that was originally appropriated for one type of program, but the governor has the authority when a disaster is declared to shift that over to deal with the need for disaster spending. The takeaway I want to have for this is that while we have these kind of simple buckets, in practice, the approaches of how this all looks is very different from state to state. There is not really any sort of standard for best practice of how to operate these. So how do you fund these type of, if you do have a disaster fund, how do you fund it? What can it be used for? How is it structured? And that's an area that we are continuing to kind of try to figure out what the best approach to planning for how proactive versus how reactive states should be in preparing for these costs. A couple chart maps here just kind of showing which states have specific disaster accounts, and then which states have various authorities to use rainy day funds for natural disasters, in addition to kind of the traditional purpose of rainy day fund for more of an economic downturn or revenue shortfall. So we also, to kind of go back and forth of this broader disasters versus specific on wildfire, a little over a year ago now, we released a report where we looked specifically at wildfire, interviewed key state and federal officials in forestry, budget, emergency management backgrounds, and to look at specifically how states were kind of get to that more granular, like what are the best practices for budgeting specifically for the costs around wildfire. And we came away with a two-pronged challenge that a lot of states were facing. One was that related to kind of ensuring there were sufficient resources for suppression and recovery as the costs are growing. And then the second was ensuring that sufficient resources were available for mitigation, which is, to slow the cost of the growth of that cost over time. On that first prong, we learned that the existing budgeting mechanisms that a lot of states were using for deciding how much to set aside for suppression each year were really falling short. What they were states tended to use these backward-looking estimates. So they said, what have we spent on suppression over the last 5 or the last 10 years, and did some sort of average to determine how much they should appropriate for the coming year. The problem is, because the costs are growing rapidly, those kind of backward-looking estimates were falling short a lot more often than they have in the past. Nothing is inherently wrong with turning to supplemental appropriations or kind of after the fact mechanisms to when you have a particularly bad disaster year. It wouldn't make sense to budget for kind of the worst possible instance every single year. That would be setting a lot of money in reserve that could be going to other purposes that won't get tapped in most years. But what we found was that states were having to reach for that supplemental appropriation not just every once in a while, but a lot of years, very regularly. And that over-reliance made it really difficult to assess how much fire was really impacting budget stability. And it really kind of made it challenging to think about what the balance of long-term planning needed to be. The second prong of that budget challenge is all around funding mitigation. And there, we heard that while there's been a lot more investment in mitigation in recent years than ever before, particularly some major federal investments, and states are putting their own funds towards it as well, there were still a lot of barriers to actually turning those dollars into risk reduction activity. Things like one challenge is prioritizing mitigation when faced with suppression and recovery costs, that if those two are competing for the same dollars, that the fire that is actively burning and paying for the people to put that out is going to win over the project that is planning for something 10 years in the future. But also some challenges regarding navigating federal funds, just the administrative burden around using that money effectively. Workforce issues, that this is kind of, there is a lot of new money dropped in, but there isn't the workforce built up to take that money and turn it into action. And just that the scale of the challenge is enormous. And so even though there is this really great one-time investment that is happening, there needs to be kind of an ongoing commitment to continue that investment over time. So those second order questions, what we found, just to sum it up, a lack of consistency and growing challenges in how different states are approaching budget. Before I move on to talk about potential solutions, I want to point out that there is some space for additional research here, some of which we're planning to look into, specifically around understanding how budgeting practices beyond wildfire, because I went into some detail there, are holding up as risk is rising, and understanding some of how the variability in different states' approaches affects the efficacy of disaster funds. So what makes an effective disaster fund versus one that kind of continues to require additional funding or additional disruption. So that leads us to the question then of what can, as we see this kind of stress on state budgets occurring, what should states be doing to better manage all of this? We have kind of landed on 3 high-level recommendations that hopefully can start to set states on a path to more disaster resilient budgeting. We've simplified them as recommendations to improve on 3 fronts: better measure, better manage, and better mitigate. I will start with measuring, and that has to do with tracking and reporting spending here. So what we have found, and I've kind of already stated this, that there's a widespread lack of comprehensive tracking of disasters related spending across all of the activities agencies are involved in. We found similar findings in our wildfire research. Understanding spending across agencies and disaster activities is really difficult for all the reasons I've already mentioned, but it's also really critical if you're going to make any changes to better address how the budgeting that states are currently engaged in. If you don't measure it, you can't begin to fix it. We haven't seen any one state that tracks everything exactly the way we prefer, but there are a number of states that are beginning to tackle this issue to get a better picture within their states. Virginia is actually one state that we have found some interesting data on. Virginia produces an annual report connected to its disaster account that gives data on reimbursements to different agencies across state government that have incurred disaster-related expenses. I think the way it works is when the disaster is declared, agencies tell the emergency management agency how much they have spent so that they get reimbursed, which is an incentive to actually report it. And then at least a good portion of the disaster related spending gets kind of collected in one place and can be reported out. So that's something we are learning more about and seeing if it's a model that other states can follow. On the mitigation side, California has made some really major investments in wildfire mitigation, for example, and they have taken some steps to build in transparency to those investments, starting to track some information about where the funded projects are being implemented and some details about what type of project they are and the project status. And hopefully that kind of information will continue to get more detailed and can inform future investments, because they'll know kind of both where they've already made progress, but also kind of can begin to assess which types of programs which types of interventions were more effective. I should say the same lesson also goes for the federal level as well. I've mentioned there's not really great cross-federal government tracking of disaster spending. There have been a couple of legislative efforts to do it that are ongoing. There's some active bills out there that would try to produce something called like a cross-cut budget type of approach, where you look across agencies, identify the disaster-related spending, and kind of report it to one centralized entity who can then put out a report. But as of right now, those are all kind of in legislative process, nothing that has been implemented. There's a wildfire commission that was congressionally created that recently came out with a whole range of reports on different wildfire or management improvements. And one of those recommendations was a wildfire-specific cross-cut budget as well. So there's interest in that, improving it at the federal level. And the data is slightly better than at the state level because it is, federal government's larger and has, different agencies do report out some of their stuff, but still a lot of work to do on federal spending as well. All right, I'm going to move on to the manage part of the measure, manage, mitigate. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about encouraging states to take a close look at whatever their current budgeting practices are and assessing whether they're working in the face of this rising disaster cost. Disasters are inherently volatile spending pressure. So some years it's going to be an enormous cost, others it's very little. And so the goal of disaster budgeting should be in part to make sure that there are sufficient funds available when needed, but also like without unduly disrupting funding for all the other budget priorities. So one step toward this type of improvement could be for states to compare their actual expenditures, which they would have to actually be tracking their actual expenditures first for this to work, but compare what they're actually spending against what they had been budgeting for in the first pass, to try and get some sense of how regularly the state is relying on sort of scrambling for after the fact supplemental appropriations to bridge funding gaps. Even if states are proactively budgeting for some amount of their disaster needs, in many cases that amount isn't going to be growing along with the increasing needs of these more frequent and severe events. There could be opportunities, if states do take this approach and examine how they're doing it, there could be opportunities to adjust how they decide how much they are putting on the proactive side, so that proactive funding does grow as the demand grows, and is based in sort of a reality as opposed to just what we've always done it this way. We also see this as a really interesting place to try and start putting better data about risk to good use, beyond just looking at historical trends in spending, which if states are actually tracking their historical spending and using that to inform what they're putting, that's a step up above what many are currently doing. But beyond just kind of looking at the past, we're interested in forward-looking ways of better understanding risk. So that could be trying to incorporate statewide resilience planning efforts into the budget process, or applying the growing set of hazard risk tools and models out there, things like catastrophe models, to help use those to inform a more realistic estimate of what disaster spending needs will be. And so it's not just looking at the history, but try and use the best science that's out there to plan for what is coming. There's still a whole lot of work to bring those two worlds together, the budgeting world versus the kind of climate risk modeling worlds. But it's something that we're interested in looking at, and we've been trying to dip our toes into. We recently hosted a convening with the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, and a number of wildfire risk modelers to try and looking at how this could apply in kind of a narrow, like local government, how much should we put aside type of simple model there. But it's definitely a work in progress. All right, so that's measure and manage. I'm going to hit the last one here, which is mitigate disaster risk. This is ultimately one of the main themes and purposes of all this work. Tracking what you're spending and managing it so that you have enough in any given year, that's very important, but it only goes so far. The only way to kind of slow the growth of the spending over time is through mitigation. The good news on this front is there is more funding available for mitigation than ever. The the IIJA and Inflation Reduction Act made generational investments in wildfire mitigation. Programs like FEMA's BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, is another good example. States are also making their own major investments as well. I mentioned California had, I think it was 2.7 billion for wildfire funding a few years back. There have been other states making very large mitigation investments as well. Unfortunately, there are still barriers to getting the actual work done. I'm sure many of you are familiar with kind of a wide range of challenges in implementing resilience projects. So I'll just talk about a couple of them that are kind of specifically related to how the funding is provided to stay in my kind of budget-oriented lane. Broadly speaking, states have to be thoughtful about how money is provided in addition to just providing more funding. So more is important. That's kind of an essential part of tackling this challenge, but it needs to be structured in a way that allows for the best possible implementation. And I'll give a couple of examples here. One is a lot of the funding that is provided for mitigation is one time and focused on individual projects. More sustained, predictable funding. You have money this year, you know you're going to have it the next year and the year after that, could make it easier to plan and identify projects with the greatest value. It could encourage more people to enter professions related to mitigation because it can establish that there is a career path that they can actually see. And it's not something where, well, once this one-time giant pot of federal money comes in and gets used up, I'm going to have to find something else to do. Two, it can be hard to compete with suppression, response, and recovery demands. If funding for kind of the urgent needs of those after the fact parts of the disaster process come from the same pool money of mitigation projects, those response, recovery, suppression needs could eat away at the mitigation funding as the demands for those after the fact parts grow over time. We've seen that happen at the federal level with wildfire spending, that the Forest Service's mitigation funding was getting used up entirely by suppression demands until there was a congressional fix that came in. So just generally finding ways to protect mitigation money from the demands of the urgent response and recovery. And then three, there's a lot of challenges with identifying, applying for, and using federal funds. It takes a great deal of kind of very specialized administrative technical capacity. That's not something every community is going to have access to. It's not something that, every small county, it makes sense to have a specialist in applying for federal grants for disasters. Some states have already made an effort to help provide some of that capacity to local governments. And there's an opportunity to kind of continue to improve investments in how that is supported so that all communities can access the federal funds that are being made available. So what comes next? I've outlined kind of some of what we've been looking at in our research. Our next phase, we are really trying to hone in on some of the specifics of what states are currently doing well and how they budget for these events, and how they can improve within all three of these themes, how they can better measure their spending, try and really drill down on what that means, helping them identify particular shortcomings in their current budgeting approaches, and how to address them, and then figuring out what are some ways that they can kind of multiply their investments in mitigation and make sure that take the steps needed to not reduce maybe, but slow the growth of these costs over time. We are also really interested in seeing the role that federal policy can play in encouraging some more proactive approaches at the state level. And we're thinking about the role of market actors in all of this too. For example, could increased interest in the cost of natural disasters from credit rating agencies or bond market buyers If they have more attention towards this as a fiscal risk, could that encourage better assessment and disclosure of natural disaster risk from state and local governments, which could then lead to more kind of proactive, positive approaches down the line? Could better transparency about the connection between disaster risk and insurance premiums in the property insurance market encourage more mitigation or less risky behavior from private actors? So we're kind of in the process of thinking about those as mechanisms to the biggest challenge in the budget world is getting people to think about the long term as opposed to the immediate now. And so just trying to use those as ways to kind of force long term thinking. And so we're going to keep thinking about ways to build on this in years to come, and are always looking for opportunities to collaborate and continue to explore these ideas. I will leave it there. Thank you all so much for listening to this, and I think we get to kick off to some group discussion now.
If you have questions, you can type them in the chat, or you could also raise your hand to ask a question. John?
See if I can turn my camera on. Hey, Peter, thanks. It seems like it's a sort of a real scatter among states for how they deal with these various things. Is that because some states have flooding disasters and others have fire disasters, or is it just every state feels like they have to be unique? I just was curious what the real problem was there.
So I think part of it is certainly the difference in disasters across areas. There's an element too where when we've talked to budget directors about this, I think in the past they have been able to get away with like being more reactive. A lot of those disaster funds that exist are not. There's not a whole lot of money in many states. But there's some of the more disaster-prone states are very know they have to put money. California budgets a ton for wildfire suppression every year, for example. But a lot of states are like, yeah, it happens every few years, and we'll find the money then, and recovery takes a while, and so we will deal with it. The problem is that works if it's once every 10 years. And if it's happening, if you're having these events more and more frequently, and if you're having smaller events that don't reach a federal threshold more and more frequently, that's where it's like this kind of it's small on the scale of state budgets, and we'll deal with it when it comes up. Might not be working as well now as it has been in the past.
So one follow-up. These disasters aren't really predictable in any meaningful way. So does that cause a problem to have states care about it? Because as you just sort of said, is it we're going to sit back and we've got a pool of money, and when something bad happens, we'll react to it. Is there any way to get out ahead of this? And I liked your idea about funding or bonds or something targeted specifically for this. So I just wondering if there's a way to be less reactive and be more sort of waiting to help. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we've seen there's some states that what they so I'll give an example of Minnesota. What they have done is they have set up a statewide disaster account, and because of the long timeline of disaster costs, or particularly on the recovery side, they can. I think they're able to do a pretty good job of predicting what their payout from their statewide disaster account is going to be for the upcoming year, and they seeded it with $30 million or something a while ago, and then they do an analysis each year of how much they think they're going to pay out. And if it starts to get low, the governor has to recommend that they deposit more money into the account at that point. That's kind of one approach. On the wildfire side, it isn't predictable, right? You don't know when you're going to have that one giant fire year, but there is going to be if you're a wildfire prone state, you're going to have some demands for suppression in any given year. So then it's just a matter of, are you missing low way too often than you should be? And that's where you can kind of see that grow. You can look to risk data and see it's going to be higher over the long term, and you need to invest more.
Yeah, that's a good point, I think, is that we know that wildfires are going to happen in certain areas. We know that flooding is going to happen in coastal Virginia and pick your place. And so you're right, is that there's probably some level of predicted spending during the year. You don't know what month it's going to happen, but you know it's going to happen. So I guess there's, the big monster problem is why we have the feds sitting on the sidelines waiting to pay us when something really screws up. Anyway, thank you, Peter. I'll let somebody else spend time with you.
Yeah, I was going
Other
to actually,
questions? Oh, Dan, go ahead.
oh, sure. I used to live in Washington State. And so, like, some of those fires, actually, I left right as some of the fires in 2015, 2016 kind of started hitting. But I agree with some of the comments regarding you don't really know when these things are going to happen because like in 2020 they got hit with like a 400-acre fire which almost double tripled everything. That's why when you it was actually interesting in your slides you had mentioned that the costs had doubled and tripled between like those two time periods, and it was mainly because of the amount of anchorage that actually happened. But I was actually curious too, two points. Does this also kind of look into neighboring state financial kind of support as well? Because I know in 2015, 2016, Northern California as well as Oregon were also pitching in money to assist in the fires that were around Oregon slash Washington State that were going on. And my second question is, do you see any kind of fall off? So if the money comes in, as an example, one of these big events happens, about how long would you say that it would kind of fall off? You know, we're not seeing anything, so you don't need that money more, and they pull it back, or is it just sporadic for each state?
Yeah, those are really really interesting questions on the neighboring state assistance part, where we've seen so we haven't seen a lot of funding coming in necessarily, but definitely it plays a big role in the kind of the preparedness side. The way it generally works is when there's a big fire, there are all these cooperative agreements. So like if there's a fire in Washington, Oregon and California agencies will come and help put it out, and that's when the and federal, U.S. Forest Service will come and help, and local governments, and then afterwards they kind of have to sort out who owes who for what. Because if it was a fire on federal land, then the federal government's going to be paying state agencies for helping for the work they did. If it's a fire on state or local jurisdiction, then that's where the initial obligation is going to be, and so Washington will be paying the California or Oregon agencies for the help that they provided. It does mean that they don't have to do as much, like train as many people or buy as much equipment, because they can count on their neighbors. That's actually one element I didn't even get into, that there's growing pressure on that assumption, because if there are more fires all the time, if you were counting that like every other state's airplanes are going to be able to come and help you when you've got the big one, but maybe there's also a big one in the next state over too. So you might have to invest more of your own money in preparedness.
Yeah, that's actually what ended up happening was we were so low on firefighters, they were literally calling all retired firefighters to come in to do wildland firefighting.
Oh, retired too. Wow. Um, that's that's fascinating. Your second question, will you remind me what the second question was? I was
Yeah, the second question was more looking at kind of the trends of fall off of funding. So if they essentially, had a big fire and they're like, oh yeah, we need to throw a ton of money at this. And so they throw the money and they're like, we need to be better prepared for the next time this happens. And then, it doesn't happen in a while and they're like, it's never going to happen. So they're just like, we're going to pull the money back. Is there like a kind of a ballpark timeline in most states that people kind of see that financial fall off?
It's a good question. I would say the challenge we've seen, the greatest interest, like this is a challenge that we have seen generally, that people pay attention to disasters when a disaster just struck. And so it's in the way I view it is it comes down to whether you are putting recurring or one-time money toward the challenge. So when a disaster strikes, you have really big needs for recovery expenses, and that's, yes, there's more political capital and interest in spending, but a lot of that money is going to go to the like, let's rebuild, let's help people get back on their feet. Maybe there's also some interest in mitigation, but it's hard to, like, you're going to get one-time investment, or it is a time when maybe you can work in sort of a firefighter pay raise or for better recruitment or add some positions or something like that. But it is kind of like people. There is a tendency for waiting for those moments to make the investment happen, which is a challenge.
Cool, thank you.
Other questions or comments? While I let people think of their questions, I wanted to go back to one of the comments that Dan had made about kind of the mutual aid and the emergency management compacts that can happen between localities and between states. And I think kind of how resources wear thin after a while, where potentially there's an inability to provide that assistance. And we saw that actually with the COVID-19 pandemic, where every locality and every state was hit by the pandemic, that they didn't have the capacity necessarily to provide assistance or provide support if the need arises from a neighboring jurisdiction. But so I'm just kind of curious thinking about how the pandemic affected the resource base of the states and whether we would expect to see kind of a ripple effect into this year and maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, where resources for disaster response and recovery particularly might be declining because states are still trying to recoup their coffers from the impacts of the pandemic.
Yeah. Surprisingly, it's almost been the opposite with the pandemic. With the pandemic, because the federal government opened the floodgates of support for states. States have been like it is starting to stop now, but states have been somewhat awash in cash. Both from, if you think about the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, within the American Rescue Plan Act, there was immense funding through something called the state SLFRF, state and local something relief fund. I'm blanking, but it was just billions of dollars being sent to the states, hundreds of billions of dollars for very flexible aid. Plus, states got a immense reimbursement from FEMA. Plus, there was an increased Medicaid match. So there was just lots of funding for anything kind of disaster related in that time, and state's own tax revenue was also kind of much higher than anticipated, probably driven in large part for federal stimulus, just kind of increased overall economic activity. So there wasn't a lot of challenge on resources there. It was a lot more focused on how do we put all of this kind of windfall federal money towards a purpose that is going to get good value, but not create a fiscal cliff going forwards. In terms of the resources of sort of using the agreements, one thing that we have heard though that you just reminded me of was there is some hesitancy among some local fire agencies, for example, to, if a neighboring state or the federal government is calling for assistance, some of them are hesitant to go because of reimbursement timelines. That like these small local agencies, they have to pay their payroll. And if they send people to a neighboring state, they are paying the payroll until they get paid back by whoever they're sending it to. And if the federal government sometimes takes 2 years to settle those kind of reimbursements, or some states get a reputation for being slower to reimburse than others, there's some are being less willing to go and provide that assistance, which kind of, to the extent that workforce and just capacity is a big challenge for everyone. That kind of further not having a funding structure that works quickly and provides you have this kind of monetary reason why you're kind of further diminishing that workforce.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.